All right, ladies and gentlemen. So this is a response to Mr. Chris Calton's little piece on income distribution. And while his work's impressive and it's enjoyable to a degree, however, this is somewhat of a sore spot for me. So I'm going to actually address this issue with a video of my own. So, when we talk about wealth inequality and why it's a problem, Mr. Calton would have you believe that it's just a simple case of the poor being angry at the rich, and maybe that has a little bit of truth to it. However, it is not the primary focus of the issue. The issue of wealth distribution is not simply it's not the act of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. It's not this Robin Hood mechanism that conservatives would have you believe. What it is a just distribution of wealth, not an arbitrary one. It is the belief that for your labor you deserve to receive a cut of the pie that is reasonable for the profits produced from that work, and not just for a fixed wage. Now, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, a very well-known book, and it's been well-known for at least 300 years, he said that in regards to any transaction, that transaction should be fair and moral and just. So when conservatives and libertarians talk about how the government shouldn't be involved in stating, in determining who gets what for how much, it's not entirely accurate, because we don't live in a completely and morally just society where everybody is concerned with being fair and just to everybody else. So, on that note, I'm going to talk a little bit about the middle class and why wages are such a crucial mechanism in society, and how their inequality can actually be destructive to society as a whole, including the economic system, as I'll talk about a little bit later. But for the moment, let me just go on and say that Mr. Calton, your assertions about wages fail to address the post-war economy, which in recorded history in this country anyway was showing the narrowest degree of wealth disparity between the working class and the wealthy, and so with those moderate disparities versus those extreme disparities, the United States economy saw one of the largest economic booms in recorded history in this country, and that would be the post-war era, which is defined. Some define it as 1949 to 1980. Some define it as 49 to 73, and I'm going to use the up to 73, because that was when the economy started cooling off from that boom. So we had about a good 34-year run, which is impressive. So over that time, over those 34 years, incomes for working Americans saw an average increase of 3 to 5% a year, which was more than enough to keep up with the rate of inflation, and was definitely more than enough to accommodate the increased profits that companies saw over time, and to compensate workers for their loyalty and their skill and their experience. And so, while it's true that people have the ability to set the price of their labor at what they believe is fair, and the company will say, okay, well, we believe this is fair. In this case, we had a third-party, unions, saying, no, we believe for everybody, this is fair. And so, and while, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of corrupt unions out there, and I'm not going to say there aren't, because there most certainly are, but there are also very good unions who do very good work for a lot of workers, even in today, where we see union membership at a sharp decline, largely due to economic policies put in place over a period of the last 30 years, which has weakened the union household substantially. So, moving on. So, when Mr. Calton begins talking about the studies done on income equality, or income disparity and income gaps, he cited probably about 10 or 11 studies, all of which are by people substantially smarter than he is from an academic point of view. Mr. Calton, when you have a master's or doctor in economics, then maybe you can start calling those people stupid and writing theses to back up those name calling. But for the moment, you're still a undergrad, and as such, you may want to consider toning it down a little bit and showing the respect to economists that they deserve for their hard work and their credentials. So, to win an argument, you don't just mock someone's argument, you dispute the facts of those arguments. And yes, we do see a lot from those studies, not as opposed to what you believe you don't see, which you are choosing not to see as well. So when we look at the wealth that people earn, the reason that people use sampling pools to determine how wages are growing or not growing is because we cannot tell how wages are growing simply by analyzing the data for a single person. And that single person does not give us a large enough picture as to the trend of income growth. Now, it is true that the wealth of the middle class and the wealth of the working poor does increase, but it's increasing at an extremely slow pace, much slower than what it needs to be increasing by. And it's not due to any factor in the economy that's retarding wage growth. It's not due to any circumstance in the larger economy that's causing the stagnation in wages. No, it's a downward pressure on wages due to the lack of jobs, but that doesn't explain the disparity of wages and the push down on wages in the 80s and 90s, where we saw record low unemployment, where we were hovering between 3.5% and 6% unemployment, which is most definitely not bad by any stretch. So there is no justification to account for employers just simply saying, well, we don't think you're worth this much now, and therefore we're not going to pay you as much as we have historically. Now, the idea of wealth inequality isn't simply to show that wealth is all collected at the top. It's to show that workers are being denied their fair piece of the pie. It shows that managers, owners, and CEOs are keeping the rewards of the company's profits, of the company's success, while actually contributing very little to the workload and not rewarding their labor for their shared success, which manifests in the form of profits. A study from the Economic Policy Institute showed that CEO pay has increased substantially faster than worker pay and continues on that trend even today, even in a state where companies are, according to big business, are suffering financially and not showing the profits they think they should be showing. Well, earth to economies everywhere, you have to have living wages to pay the taxes to provide the revenues for the government, unless you want the government to start levying 75 or 80% income tax rates on big business if they're all going to be concentrated at the top. And that was the way FDR did it in the 30s and 40s to discourage such hoarding of wealth. And that was because workers needed the wages to survive, especially during a time when we're at war and when we were in a time of crisis in this country, where we turned the U.S. economic and industrial machine on turbo mode and pumped out a huge amount of growth in a very short period of time, strictly for the purpose of fighting a war across two oceans. Now, moving on to some comments about the minimum wage. It always comes up in these kinds of discussions. So what I'll say is, right now, people, including myself, will concede that individuals on the minimum wage do move into at least low middle class incomes over time. However, where wealth inequality is becoming a problem is we have a middle class that is losing ground on their wages, as in their wages are not increasing and steadily decreasing as time progresses. while those wages at the top are increasing ever so fast and faster. Now, libertarians will say, well, that's the natural flow of the market for wealth to flow upwards. It's like, no, it's not. We had 40 years of proof for that, where we saw companies from the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that had very modest CEO pay, but at the same time paid a very living wage to their workers, including benefits, health insurance, retirement plans, and pensions. And it's only been the last 20 years that we've seen those systems of retirement and savings steadily dismantled, and then that money that would otherwise go to workers being given to the top management or owners or shareholders instead. As those wages decrease, what that means is that you are actually destroying your tax base. You are destroying your disposable income pool by holding wages down artificially. And yes, I'm going to assert the market is doing it artificially. There is no economic justification for doing so except for greed and selfishness. That is the only probable reason that wages are being held down the way they are. It is, in effect, a form of wage theft. Now, it may not be theft in that wages are being withheld from the work you have agreed to do, but it is wage theft that you are withholding the fair part of the pie that belongs to workers for the work they do. And, libertarians again are going to come out and say, well, they agreed to work for this much money for this much labor, but that doesn't make it right. Just because workers agree to work for a wage does not mean you have to pay them that wage only. It means that you are agreeing to pay them for their investment of time and effort into your venture, and then whatever profits derive from that venture, you have an obligation, a moral and ethical obligation, to share those profits with your workers and as a form of appreciation, and to invest in the long term. The idea of wage theft is an extremely short-sighted and short-term maneuver for a business, and it's extremely unwise because you hurt your bottom line for the foreseeable future. And that's the trend we've been seeing in big business, is that they have been making decisions that affect their short-term interests but don't account for their long-term interests, and these companies are the ones that end up collapsing under themselves from all the pork and waste sent up at the top of the chain instead of shared with their workers and mutually shared fairly. Now, a couple other things I'll say real quick. The comment from Elizabeth Warren this last week got a lot of news because she said minimum wage and $22 in the same sentence, and instantly the conservative news machine thought she meant, oh, we should pay workers a $22 minimum wage. No, that's not what she's saying. And let's be clear. Elizabeth Warren was talking about the amount of wages earned to the amount of productivity expended to create those profits. And what she's saying is the amount of work the American worker is doing for the money he's earning is significantly higher than it has ever been, meaning people are working significantly harder for their wages but not seeing any of the returns from that productivity. And that is why she said if you index productivity to the minimum wage, the value is about $22 an hour. And she was speaking to a committee, I don't remember which one exactly, and then she had an expert witness that she was questioning regarding this issue who had actually done the research on this matter. So the assertion that that workers are lazy and not deserving of the wages they earn is complete bullpucky, as Rachel Maddow would say. So, moving on. Even Mr. Calton, Mr. Chris Calton, should concede that your wages should reflect your productivity, and that it is reasonable to be fair with the fruits of that productivity. It's both ethical, moral, and just to do so. Also, and to argue from Mr. Calton's libertarian philosophy, Adam Smith, who is the shining jewel of any free market economist, argues the same thing, that it's not that you're engaging in an exchange, it's that both are mutually engaging in an exchange that benefit each other. It's not one screwing the other. So it's not the worker ripping the employer off or the employer ripping the worker off. It's both have come to a fair and reasonable wage, and together collaborate to create a good product, and both walk away with a fair cut of the pie. Now, it'd be one thing if we saw CEOs and the super wealthy providing massive amounts of charity to society. This is in regards to the argument against corporate taxation or personal taxation. In Adam Smith's idyllic world, where he writes The Wealth of Nations from, he was a believer that the super wealthy and the capitalist and the wealthy businessman are the means of which the social safety net is provided, and that means like low cost or free housing for the poor, job training for people who don't know how to do things, whatever those roles would be, things that normally would be taken on in today's world by the government. We provide a free education for our children. We provide a heavily discounted college education for our young adults and young people, but none of that is being taken on by any corporate entity that I've been able to see. Occasionally we get maybe a corporate donation to a university or an endowment or a scholarship or something like that, but nothing largely systematic or consistent that we can see. And that kind of benevolence is something that's been very absent from our society for quite some time. There's only a few firms that I've ever seen provide that level of support for the working man and young adult. And so without that benevolence, such a system that libertarians describe, where we have this absence of government from wages and productivity, is a big deal. Or is the case at hand. Mr. Chris, you do assert that the argument for wages and inequality should shift to the individual. The reason conservatives would love that to be the discussion of debate is because then you can highlight specific people and say, it's possible, therefore we shouldn't fix it. However, that's not good public policy. You can't measure public policy based on the statistics of a single person, as that single person is not representative of the entire population. By measuring groups of people, we can map trends in a particular demographic. Now, granted, any study is never going to be exact, and we make mistakes. People make mistakes all the time. Liberal economists make mistakes. Conservative economists make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. It's the nature of humanity. We are not perfect in any way, shape, or form. But it is important that you understand that in every single sample, you're going to have anomalies. These dots of people that stick way out in left field or right field or north or south or wherever of the collected dots of that pool, and you can't use those dots and say, "Ha! See, there's the proof," because it doesn't work. It's sloppy and it's elementary, really, in regards to research and methodology. In regards to your complaint about obesity, this is I wasn't quite sure how to address this one because, quite frankly, your ability to understand the nature of obesity is somewhat lacking, I'll say, and take it from a obese person. Have you considered that obesity is a problem for the working poor because they don't have the free time to properly address their health problems and properly care for their fitness? It does cost a fair bit of money to go work out at a fitness facility. They may not have the resources or to have someone care for their children if they are single and have a home, or if they single or have a single home wage earner. They tend to work on and off. So if you have two wage earners in a home, one is at home watching the kids and the other is working, and then they swap each other. So one goes to work in the swing, and the other goes to work in the morning. And so you don't always have the freedom to go and do those kinds of things because you have children to take care of. It's especially harder for single parents. But what's common among both sets, both two-parent and single-parent households, is you have the problem of preparation of food, where again, time is always the issue. Minimum wage earners or near minimum wage earners are always working as much as they can to provide as much as they can for their children, and generally it's not enough, especially in states where the minimum wage is the federal or close to the federal. We have states that are ranging from $7.25 an hour all the way up to $9.19 an hour, like Washington State. Or if you happen to be living in San Francisco, it's about $10.25 an hour. Now, the side effect of earning minimum wage is that you also tend to eat from places that pay minimum wage, such as fast food. Now, I'm not going to make an excuse because, again, there's always parents who seem to find time to do it occasionally. But as a whole, the impoverished and low income generally cannot afford a consistent amount of fresh food, nor do they have the time to properly prepare it for their families. And so that has contributed greatly to the obesity problem because fast food has generally become cheaper than buying fresh food. So you end up with a problem where people are eating fast food several times a week or even several times a day even. And that is contributing greatly to the obesity problem. It's not this that the poor are just consuming food in massive amounts of quantity. It's that the quality of the food is contributing to the obesity issue in the low income. So you may want to do a little more research in that area before you assert that the poor are getting plenty to eat, because that's most certainly not the case all the time. Also, some other factors to keep in mind is generally poor families don't have access to medical care, or medical maintenance care, I should say. They have access to an emergency room. They can see an ER doctor. Usually it's a bill me service. So they go in, they see a ER doctor, he sends them the bill, the hospital sends them the bill, and then they just kind of forget about it and don't pay it or file bankruptcy. Same thing again. Adults generally do not have the means to go see a medical practitioner, a family doctor. There are not enough free and nonprofit clinics to account for the 45 million Americans that do not have health insurance, and nor is there a system in place to account for medical maintenance, which may assist in reducing the obesity epidemic as a whole. So, for households that are barely squeaking by month to month, and where there is literally no disposable income because it's all being dumped into basic needs, you're going to have an obesity problem among the poor because they do not have the means to provide for their fitness, which you as well as I know does cost money and time to invest in. And if you don't have it, then you can't do it. Plain and simple. Another point, which I touched on earlier, the income disparity problem for the economy causes a problem for states, largely, because the state tax systems are so diverse and so different. But there's one thing that most of them have in common, is they depend on the spending habits of their populations. Washington has a sales tax, California has a sales tax, Idaho has a sales tax. Nevada, I don't think has any taxes, but they get a lot of their money from gambling. But the point being is that as incomes steadily decrease over time due to the lack of wage growth, you end up with a system of incomes which are basically unable to be the tax base any longer. And part of it is several factors to do with it, but in part, one of them is that the tax systems in these states are generally archaic. They are based on a goods-producing economy, as opposed to an income-based or a services economy, which is, people provide services and get money from those services, versus producing a product where the sales tax and other flat-rate commodity taxes came into play. Like in Washington, we have the B&O tax, but it's largely out of date because we're not a goods-producing state as much as we used to be. So it is necessary for wages to grow over time. It's necessary to properly equip enough of the people with incomes with which to provide for their state's basic services, whether that be a heavy welfare state like Washington is. I mean, we have a large welfare budget because we are a welfare state, and proudly so. We value our services, and we don't like cutting them if we don't have to, because they help a lot of people. However, any state is going to need money to fund their education systems, to fund their colleges and universities, to fund their police departments and fire departments, to maintain their roads, to fix their bridges, as Indiana and Illinois found, it was Indiana and Arkansas found out the hard way. that you actually need taxes to maintain this infrastructure, which is necessary for business to work. So, and to assert that you should contract it out and let private interests do it, no, it doesn't work that way. No, roads are community property. They're part of the commons, and they belong to the citizens of that state. Okay, so moving on. One concession I will make about the minimum wage is that the minimum wage is designed to provide a minimum standard of living, but living being the key word. It's not meant to thrust people into poverty, into homelessness, which is essentially what the wage is steadily doing because it does not rise with inflation. So currently, the wage is $7.25. No one can live on $7.25. It's about $15,080 a year at 40 hours a week times 52 weeks a year. That's assuming you work all the time, have perfect health, and never get sick or have any family emergency whatsoever. Yeah, right about that. Again, the minimum wage should provide for some basic needs: housing, utilities, a month's worth of food, and a little bit of money for medical care. If you do not have those things, you cannot move up. If your basic needs cannot be met, you cannot advance in the hierarchy of needs and start working on improving yourself, and then move past that and start acting benevolently to your fellow man in a more permanent manner. So without those basic needs being met, and basic needs I'll define as basic housing, shelter, utilities, transportation to and fro, 1 month's worth of food, capable of meeting at least 2,000 calories of nourishment per day for 31 days, and a basic level of health care. Wages cannot provide those wages that cannot provide those basics create larger social problems for society, increasing costs that much more, such as crime. When citizens in a society feel that the mechanisms of their society cannot provide them with the means of providing for their basic needs, then the said person will look for those basic needs through other means, whether it be through relocation or, to the extreme, could mean systems that operate outside the law. Gangs being the best example. Inner city gangs are generally collections of young people who are not getting their basic needs at home, and so they break out and they collaborate with their friends to meet those needs. This is all I have. I'm going to go ahead and upload this and post it as a response to Mr. Calton's Inequality video, so this should be very interesting. This will be the first time responding to one of his posts directly, instead of my 10-page essay that I tend to write after he posts something. So this should be interesting, and I look forward to his response and your comments of the topic. Toodaloo.